Welcome to Mr. Hutchings History, where the past comes alive. Let's dive into today's story.
Okay, so we're diving deep into the Cold War again, but this time focusing on something that sounds almost too good to be true. Khrushchev's peaceful coexistence policy. I mean, two superpowers deciding to just get along.
Yeah, peaceful coexistence. It definitely sounds a lot simpler than it actually was. Think of it more like a high-wire act with a lot of tension and suspicion, rather than a friendly handshake.
Definitely not your average history lesson. So to really get a grip on this, we need to start with the big picture, right?
Absolutely. Context is key here. We're talking about the post-Stalin era, 1953, when Khrushchev takes over. Now, this was a huge turning point. Imagine, after decades of Stalin's iron fist, suddenly there's a possibility of things thawing out a bit,
Right, because Stalin's death kind of throws things up in the air a bit, doesn't it? Like, what direction is the Soviet Union even going to go in?
Exactly. And that's what makes Khrushchev so interesting. He was a bit of a wild card. He believed in the communist system, sure, but he also saw that a nuclear war, well, that would be bad for everyone,
Mutually assured destruction kind of puts a damper on things.
to put it mildly. So that's where peaceful coexistence comes in. Khrushchev's way of saying, look, we have our differences, but let's not blow up the planet over them.
Which is kind of a radical idea considering the traditional Leninist view was all about the inevitable clash between communism and capitalism, right?
Exactly. It was a huge departure. And to make things even more complicated, Khrushchev had to balance this new approach with keeping the hardliners and the Soviet leadership happy. There's a real balancing act.
A tightrope walk, for sure. So how did the rest of the world react to this peaceful coexistence idea? Was it met with open arms?
Well, there were definitely some promising signs early on.
Like the Austrian State Treaty in 1955.
Exactly. That was a big one. Think about it. After years of being divided and occupied since Potsdam,
Yeah.
that conference that really set the Cold War in motion, Austria finally becomes a neutral state again.
Pretty historic moment.
Huge win for both sides. And it showed that negotiation and compromise, maybe they could actually work. And then later that same year, you had the Geneva Summit.
World leaders, back at the same table again. First time since Potsdam, right?
Right. And it wasn't just a photo op either. Eisenhower and Khrushchev, they actually sat down, talked, even agreed on some cultural and scientific exchanges. It seemed like peaceful coexistence might actually have some legs.
A glimmer of hope in a pretty dark time, but I'm guessing it couldn't all be smooth sailing from there.
You're right to be skeptical, because beneath this hopeful exterior, there was still a lot of mistrust.
So we've got this undercurrent of mistrust, even with these positive steps. Was there anything that really brought that tension to the surface?
Oh, absolutely. 1956 was a turning point. That's when things get real, and peaceful coexistence faces its first major tests.
And those tests being?
The Hungarian Uprising and the Suez Crisis. Two major events that really expose the limits of this whole peaceful coexistence idea.
Let's unpack those, starting with Hungary. What happened there?
So picture this. Budapest, October 1956. People are fed up with Soviet control. They want freedom, they want reforms, and they're not afraid to take to the streets to demand it.
A full-blown uprising.
It was a pivotal moment. And for a little while, it seemed like maybe, just maybe, things were changing for real. Even Pravda, the Soviet Union's official newspaper, hinted at greater equality between the Soviet Union and its satellite states in Eastern Europe.
Wow, that's significant. So what happened? Why didn't things change?
Well, that's the tragedy of it. Just days after those hints in Pravda, Soviet tanks roll into Budapest to crush the uprising. It was a brutal crackdown.
And not exactly a ringing endorsement for peaceful coexistence.
No, not at all. Thousands of Hungarians were killed. Imre Nagy, the reformist leader who had emerged during the uprising, executed.
So much for thawing out.
It was a harsh reminder that while Khrushchev might have been open to easing tensions with the West, he wasn't about to loosen his grip on the Soviet sphere.
Peaceful coexistence had its limits. How did the rest of the world react to this?
It sent shockwaves everywhere. Here's Khrushchev talking about peaceful coexistence while simultaneously crushing a pro-democracy movement. It really raised doubts about his sincerity.
A major setback for peaceful coexistence.
Definitely. And then, right on the heels of Hungary, you have the Suez Crisis.
Okay, and this one always seemed a bit murky to me. It's like the U.S. and the USSR are on the same side, but not really.
Yeah, it's a weird one. So you've got Britain, France, and Israel launching a military operation to try and take back the Suez Canal from Egypt. Both the U.S. and the Soviet Union condemned it.
So they were united, right?
On the surface, yes. But as always, things were way more complicated behind the scenes.
Because both sides saw a chance to advance their own interests.
Exactly. The U.S., worried about the Soviet Union gaining influence in the Middle East, used the crisis to position itself as a protector of newly independent nations.
A convenient way to frame their involvement?
You could say that. And it really sets the stage for the Eisenhower Doctrine, where the U.S. pledges to defend any Middle Eastern country facing communist threats.
So even when they agreed, they were still competing.
It basically confirmed that peaceful coexistence didn't mean the rivalry was over. It was just playing out in more complex ways.
So peaceful coexistence is facing some serious challenges. What happens next? How does this whole thing play out?
Well, just as the world is trying to make sense of these events, the rivalry between the superpowers takes on a whole new dimension.
We're talking about space, right? Sputnik, 1957.
Exactly. Imagine, it's October 4th, 1957. The Soviet Union launches Sputnik, the first artificial satellite to orbit the Earth. And it's not just a technological marvel, it's a wake-up call for the United States.
We'll talk about a power move.
It completely changed the game. Suddenly, the Soviets weren't just a threat on land and sea, they were a spacefaring nation. It fueled a sense of urgency, even fear in the U.S. They had to catch up.
And so the space race begins. But let's not forget about that other race that was already well underway, the arms race.
Right, and that's only escalating. Both sides are pouring resources into building more and more powerful nuclear weapons. It's a scary time.
The ultimate paradox. Trying to make peaceful coexistence work while preparing for the unthinkable. So with all this going on, how did historians try to make sense of peaceful coexistence?
It's a question that sparked a lot of debate. There are a few different schools of thought on this.
Like what?
Well, you've got the traditional view, the Orthodox view, which argues that peaceful coexistence was never really sincere. It was just a tactic Khrushchev used to buy the Soviet Union time and lull the West into a false sense of security.
So more like a Cold War strategy than a genuine attempt at peace.
Exactly. Then there's the revisionist perspective, which argues that Khrushchev was actually serious about wanting to reduce tensions, but his efforts were constantly undermined by the U.S., who, weren't exactly making it easy.
Okay, so two very different takes. Did anyone try to find a middle ground?
Yeah, eventually you have the post-revisionists coming in. They acknowledge that both sides played a part in shaping how things unfolded.
So a more nuanced understanding. What about after the Cold War ended? Did the opening of Soviet archives shed any new light on things?
Absolutely. We got access to all these previously classified documents, which gave us a much deeper understanding of Khrushchev's thinking, his motivations.
And what did those documents reveal?
A much more complex picture than we might have expected. We see a leader dealing with internal pressures within his own government, trying to navigate a really tense geopolitical landscape, and yes, genuinely trying to prevent a nuclear war.
It sounds like there's no easy answer here. So how should we think about peaceful coexistence today, looking back?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? It was a flawed policy, for sure. It wasn't always peaceful, and the coexistence was often pretty strained. But it did create a space for dialogue, a set of principles that, even if they weren't always followed, helped prevent things from spiraling into a full-blown global conflict.
That delicate balance?
Absolutely. And I think the biggest takeaway is that even in the midst of these really deep ideological divides, communication, dialogue, trying to find common ground, it's essential. It's the only way to prevent these kinds of situations from escalating into something truly catastrophic.
A lesson that feels as relevant as ever. Well, this has been a fascinating deep dive. Thank you so much for taking us through it.
It's been my pleasure. The Cold War was such a complex and pivotal period. It's always worth revisiting and learning more about it.
Thanks for listening to Mr. Hutchings History. Keep exploring, and we'll see you next time.